Welcome to the ICAS Expert Voices Initiative, which is a series of on-camera, sit-down interviews with leading experts on important issues in the US-China bilateral relationship. Today's program will be a discussion between ICAS Senior Fellow Sarab Gupta and James Borton, a Senior Fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies Foreign Policy Institute, on the prevailing issues that plague ongoing geopolitical conflicts in the South China Sea, in addition to his views on how common ground can be found in the realm of scientific diplomacy, fisheries, conservation efforts, and more. James Borton is an independent environmental policy writer and former Hong Kong-based foreign correspondent for the Washington Times. He contributes regularly to the Asia Sentinel, the Asia Times, East Asia Forum, Geopolitical Monitor, Nikkei Asian Review, the South China Morning Post, Project Syndicate, and World Politics Review. He has edited 4 books: The South China Sea, Challenges and Promises, Islands and Rocks in the South China Sea, Post-Hague Ruling, The Art of Medicine in Metaphors, and Venture Japan. He was a past National Endowment Humanities Fellow at Yale University. He has both a Bachelor's and Master's of Arts with honors in American Studies from the University of Maryland. He has been a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, the US Asia Institute, and Tufts University Science Diplomacy Center, and has participated in numerous South China Sea conferences. He also co-founded the Mekong Environment Forum in San Tho, Vietnam. He has just recently published his latest book, Dispatches from the South China Sea, Navigating to Common Ground. Many of the topics discussed in today's Expert Voices initiative will be found in greater detail in his new book. On behalf of ICAS, welcome to the program. Sarab, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. James, it's terrific to have you on the Expert Voices initiative. I'm looking forward to the conversation. You have tremendous experience in Southeast Asia, as well as with regard to the South China Sea. It's a very topical issue, and I'm looking forward to having this great conversation with you. Welcome again to the Expert Voices initiative.
Thank you.
Just as a table setter, before we really get down to some of the South China Sea issues, just again, as a table setter with regard to the background issues in the general geopolitics in that part of the world. Earlier this month, or rather it was last month, in about, what was it, about June 10th, we had the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, for the first time in person in almost 3 years. Can you tell us a little bit, bring us up to speed on the latest security and geopolitical developments in that were discussed at Shangri-La, and specifically with regard to Southeast Asia?
Certainly. China and the US follow different geopolitical compasses, and their polar positions were most visible at the Shangri-La dialogue. It was clear that the US position, reflected by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, offered an expected kind of navigational chart outlining America's commitment to the Indo-Pacific. Washington emphasized the vital importance of a rules-based international order as much as in the Indo-Pacific as it does in Europe, and continued to call out China's threat to international order. For sure, the delegates from the 59 countries represented understood the plethora of challenges in the region, from energy and food insecurity, climate change crisis, and the economic and health security fallout of COVID-19. With the Southeast Asian nations focused on the US-China competition in the region, the Biden administration did not hesitate to roll out and talk about the new Indo-Pacific Partnership for Maritime Domain Awareness. It was introduced to provide better access to space-based maritime domain awareness to countries across the region, including Southeast Asia. China's response, reflected in the remarks of General Wei, succeeded all too well in ramping up the rivalry and rising tension between China and America. The language was blunt and undiplomatic when he declared that China's rise and continued development and expansion could not be stopped by any quad security dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and the US, or even the trilateral security pact between Australia, the UK, and the US. Beijing's warning about the formation of these blocks, new and old, proved to be another shot over the bows of the increasing number of naval warships dotting the maritime seascape. The message from China, or from Beijing directly, is China cannot be isolated or excluded from the region. And General Wei was effective in underscoring the litany of security issues that all Southeast Asian nations are rattled by, including Taiwan, punctuated by President Biden's remark a few weeks ago that the US military commitment to defend the island if an attack were launched by China, the South China Sea, North Korea, and of course the coalition blocs. While President Biden's remarks were rolled back to assert that the US accepts the One China policy guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, and the White House underscored that Washington does not support Taiwan independence, the geopolitical damage had already been done. But the prevailing consensus among the Southeast Asian delegates is that they will not choose sides between Beijing and Washington. And as such, China and the US need to take seriously a kind of a re-examination of their imposed red lines and take steps to urgently ratchet down their reactionary rhetoric. My hope is that they might seek out some common higher ground to address issues like climate change and harness and share the data to tackle illegal fishing in the contested region.
Very interesting, thank you. On an even more topical note, I think it was yesterday, the new Philippines president, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. was inaugurated. And of course, the Marcos family comes with a long history, not always a very storied history, but he came through with a very, very strong popular mandate. Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact of President Marcos's ascension to the presidency with regard to Southeast Asia?
His victory marks his family's stunning return to power 36 years after they were forced into exile in the United States by a people power revolution. I believe that Marcos will continue dialogue and diplomacy with China in relation to the South China Sea and perhaps even expand the economic ties with Beijing. At the same time, I also believe that he will sustain the alliance ties with the US, including the regular military exercise, and it wouldn't surprise me if they step up those military exercises. Economic recovery from the pandemic, the huge debt and inflation are his key priorities, and he will, I think, engage any partner that can help him address these issues. Economically, he may lean more to Beijing, but the US will remain a critical security partner. Some media outlets have even quoted him as saying he could set aside the 2006 international ruling invalidating China's expansive claims in the South China Sea because China did not recognize it. Unlike his predecessor, I think there will be less bluster and rhetoric. His rhetoric will be much more formal and maybe enabling some kind of statecraft diplomacy that we have not seen in the prior administration. Expect Marcos also to pay a visit to all the major and middle powers, including the US and allies, Australia and Europe, which Duterte in his 6 years did not do.
Interesting point, the last point, that yes, Mr. Duterte, he really didn't travel as much as he could have and should have to many of the main powers, and that Mr. Marcos might be a change in this regard. Let's move on to your new book, titled Dispatches from the South China Sea, Navigating to Common Ground. Your book primarily focuses on Vietnam. Can you tell us a little bit about why the focus on Vietnam, and how do Vietnamese maritime policies, defense, fisheries, ecotourism, etc., compare with China's and other Southeast Asian nations like, say, the Philippines and Thailand?
As a reporter for the Washington Times, I've been there in Vietnam from 1997 to literally the present. And I was initially trying to understand Vietnam's reform policies, especially following the arrival of the internet. And at that time, I was invited by Nguyen An Thuan, the founder of Vietnam Net, a successful bilingual news online site, to meet with his energetic, really young bilingual staff who expressed interest in speaking with an American journalist and learning more about Western reporting methods. What was quickly revealed to me is that this new generation of educated young Vietnamese consume news online, and that the government was ill prepared for the arrival of the social media and its impact on the millennials. During that time, late 1998, 99, the internet cafes were quickly opening up throughout the country. And the biggest change I witnessed over these decades in traveling and reporting in Vietnam is the success of Hanoi's reforms that have lifted millions from poverty and prompted a rising optimism about the future heard from the younger Vietnamese, since about 70% of the country's, 98 million were born after the war. But it was my conversations with other Vietnamese reporters and writers, like the famous novelist Le Minh Quay. I learned how the Vietnamese value their EC and hold a deep respect, if not reverence, for their fishermen. Naturally, as a myself, having lived off the Chesapeake Bay, I appreciated that, and I was eager to interview these fishermen and to hear their hardscrabble stories related to the perils of fishing in the South China Sea. And of course, naturally, their skirmishes with Chinese trawlers in contested waters and the decline in fish stocks. In the course of my reporting in the country, I was introduced to several of Vietnam's leading marine scientists, including Dr. Nguyen Chi Hoi and Dr. Chu Man Trinh. And from them, I gained knowledge about how they are navigating the intersection of policy and science through their ambitious and successful marine protected areas. And since I enjoyed access to an increasing number of sources in Vietnam, I spent more of my reporting time in the country examining the environmental security marine issues. However, during that time, I also traveled reported out of the Philippines. I went specifically from Manila to Mindanao, to General Santos City, to meet with what was referred to as the tycoon of fishing, Rodrigo Rivera. And with over 250 fishing trawlers, super seiners, he established tuna canning operations in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, where thousands of tons of tuna are caught and processed daily. But like other nations, the Philippines knows that fish stocks are at a risk of collapse. And for sure, the contested and overfished South China Sea is widely regarded as one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. And it's no wonder that other nations like, Thailand and Indonesia also fiercely compete for the fish stock. So no one denies that China's rapid economic development has driven explosive growth and demand for the ocean's natural resource, especially of fish, offshore oil and gas included, and seabed minerals. Yet tensions over the conflicting sovereignty claims in the sea, exacerbated by China's expansion of its maritime ambitions, have led to overfishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, marine pollution, and the degradation of natural marine habitats. Since you're asking me to comment and compare perhaps the various nations' marine or maritime policies, I think both Philippines and Vietnam remain on the front lines of maritime disputes with China, for sure. They both deny, China's claims over the sea area. They also both object to China's imposed annual fishing ban in the South China Sea. Nevertheless, China and Vietnam, given their long history, have established far more formal and informal dialogues as opposed to the Philippines. And for now, I think both nations still tack between cooperation and struggle with China in the South China Sea. Naturally, China understands all too well the larger geopolitical and economic pressures stemming from competition in commercial fishing. But for most observers and the nations involved in the South China Sea, the central and obvious conflicts have centered on sovereignty and judicial claims rather than fishing quotas and biodiversity conservation and sustainability. But let's be clear, marine biologists estimate that fishing operations will need to drop by 50% to sustain the target species. Let me, better frame why so many Chinese fishing boats are at sea. China is the world's leading seafood exporter, and the country's population also accounts for more than a third of all fish consumption worldwide. Since they've already fished out their own coastline, their fishing boats must sail farther into neighboring waters and as far away now as Africa, South America, and the Pacific to exploit the waters of island nations. And despite making some reduction in subsidies for their domestic fishery, it has not reduced those for the global fishing fleet. It's equally important to note that although the South China Sea accounts for 12% of the global catches, more than 50% of China's global fishing fleet operates in this region. And the statistics are grim, with 3/4 of the world's fish stocks now being harvested faster than they can reproduce. 80% are fully exploited, or they're in decline, including tuna, sharks, swordfish, cod, halibut are fast disappearing. Beijing knows how much is at stake. They and the other claimants understand that outright fishing moratoriums or bans will not solve the problem. It is in the ecological domain that cooperation is needed and now, and offers the most potential for conflict resolution.
Interesting and grim, of course, to a certain extent. Maybe there is a little bit of good news to be had in this regard. Within this past month of the WTO, they were able to find an agreement with regard to having disciplines on fishing subsidies, especially with regard to IUU fishing, trying to knock that out, as well as cutting down on state subsidies for fishing fleets, which will end up overfishing. We'll just have to see how that plays itself out, but at least that's a little bit of good news. But sticking with the fishing issue, sticking to Vietnam and sticking to Vietnam and its contact and engagement with the sea, let's just step back a little bit into history. You know, Vietnam is an ancient civilization, just like much of Southeast Asia, and once ruled the waves of the South China Sea before it was actually called that. It was called the Champa Sea after the rulers, the Cham people, and whose kingdom spanned the waterways from Malaysia to Okinawa. This is a historical dimension I think most people are unaware of, and it would be great if you could fill us in a little bit. You have visited Cham communities on island archipelagos. You state that in the book, and can you tell us a little bit about their history and their legacy as traditional custodians of the sea?
Certainly. I was fortunate to meet Dr. Chu Man Trinh, a Vietnamese marine biologist, along with some of his graduate students from Da Nang University, who first introduced me to the rich Cham culture, now visible at Cu La Cham Island, which is located about 20 kilometers off Vietnam's central coast, near Hoi An. You arrive on that island and you're surrounded, this clean harbor. There's a patina of living corals, jewels of the sea that sort of offer an iridescent, well, combination of blue, pink, golden yellow, and green coloration. Here the residents know that their corals reveal many stories. And the Cham is a 300 square kilometer archipelago, also referred to as Mae Lao Cham, or mother of the Cham Island. You referenced earlier about the Cham's historic vast trade and ocean-going network that extended from northeast to China, Taiwan, Japan, and south to Malaysia and Indonesia. And from the second to the mid-15th century, the Chams populated Chama, a contiguous territory of independent principalities in central and southern Vietnam. But today, and what I have witnessed in the stories I've learned, the Cham and their kin descendants are immersed in a unique kind of ecological protection of their way of life that is seen in this successful model there in Cu La Cham. I think Vietnam, like China and other nations in the region, continue to find themselves in a difficult crossroads between economic development that brings prosperity to its people and the need to balance conservation initiatives that maintain the rich beauty and natural heritage of the country. At Cu La Cham Island, well, the establishment of the MPA, the Marine Protected Area, offers about 280 coral species, 250 reef fish species, and 97 types of mollusks. And while this is not as significant in marine biodiversity as the Great Barrier Reef or the Coral Triangle in the South China Sea, it's now recognized as an excellent kind of ecotourism model without any of the typical and associated problems of pollution. No plastics are found on the island. In fact, you're not allowed to bring your plastic bottle onto the sewage, no harvesting of coral reef for use in construction. And along with this, there's the economic dividends of ecotourism and dive shops. And many of those fishermen are very happy to sort of retire their nets and open up their dive shops to take these ecotourists into their beautiful coral reefs. The fishermen, these are descendants of the Cham that I met there. They still mend their fishing nets and they share their fish catches of the day with the community. If someone has a bad fishing day, then they're going to share their catches. But several of the Kula Cham fishers also told me that they never turn away a distressed Chinese fishing trawler seeking a safe harbor during those fast-moving typhoons across the South China Sea. I'm not saying that they're dropping all geopolitics, but they welcome them. They provide a safe harbor. It's part of their culture. The Cham cultural beliefs run as deep as the ocean, and that includes their special ceremonies for dead whales washed ashore along their coast. They believe that the protection of their corals and their respect, if not reverence, shown whales brings them good fishing and good luck. Who can deny that? I've spent many hours listening to their kind of cultural mythic legends and stories of how whales have even saved fishermen's lives caught out in bad storms. It seems to me that the South China Sea's claimant nations need to take a page or two from Kula Cham's history and myths and science adoption, since it links their valued ocean relationships from ancestral beliefs, myths, and sustainable marine ecosystems.
That's absolutely fascinating because, you know, if we left the South China Sea in the hands of its traditional custodians, regardless of borders, we would have a beautiful sea. And it's modern day law and modern day commercial fishing and all sorts of other things which have effectively complicated issues, despoiled issues. And I personally have always been an adherent of the point that traditional artisanal fishermen in the South China Sea, regardless of whichever country or state that they may come from, have a historic right to fish anywhere in the sea. The problem has been that this business of historic right has then got caught up with China's 9-dash line, and China itself has not provided clarification clearly enough that 9-dash line should only be about traditional fishing. It's tried to lump other things in, and it's become a political hot potato. And it's really unfortunate because I personally think leave it to artisanal fishermen and they would protect the sea, and they form a community, a cross-border community where they could live happily and peacefully and let others live too. Talking in terms of China, getting a little political out here, you know, you've talked a bit about the Chinese fishing fleet. Can you talk a little bit about what is known as China's maritime militia, and also to some extent, does Vietnam have a certain counterpart militia, and generally what is the role of this militia in these waters?
I think Beijing's modern naval strategy has brought into the disputed sea an entire flotilla of Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia to ensure its control of the once fertile fishing waters. And this is part of their ocean development strategy. And as part of this development and explanation, China is now recognized as the world leader in shipbuilding. China's national directive includes at least 3,000 reported blue water trawlers and somewhere up to 700,000 fishing boats. The armada of distant fishing vessels enables one boat alone to scoop up as many fish in a week as a local traditional fishing trawler does in a year. For China, it's all too apparent that the fish stocks are more valuable than diamonds. Overall, the fisheries and marine industry in China provide more than 25 million jobs. Allow me to sort of better frame why so many Chinese fishing boats are at sea. China is the world's leading seafood exporter, and the country's population also accounts for more than a third of all fish consumption worldwide. Since the Chinese have already fished out their own coastline, their fishing boats must sail farther into neighboring water and as far away as Africa, South America, and the Pacific to exploit the waters of island nations. And, despite making some reduction in subsidies for the domestic fishery, it has not reduced those for the global fishing fleet. It's equally important to note that although the South China Sea accounts for 12% of the global catches, more than 50% of China's global fishing fleet operate in the region. China's distant water fishing vessels help kind of rewrite the rules of freedom of navigation and buttress its maritime claims in securing the vital resources and extend its economic reach across the globe. These so-called gray zone operations, or maritime militia, is their use of this overtly civilian distant water fishing fleets, which are to varying degrees associated with the Chinese government agencies. So far, what we are witnessing are these fishing fleets competing with other claimant nations over diminishing fish stocks. But studies by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, aided by satellite imagery, confirm the increasing numbers of paramilitary Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. It is specifically in the areas near the paracels and spratlys where these Chinese vessels often, all too often, obstruct, harass, and threaten other fishing boats.
I'd like to turn to scientific diplomacy, but before I get to that, one last question, staying with the fisheries part. Just a little bit, if you could talk to us about the role of the Taiwanese in the South China Sea. I'm speaking particularly in the context of, in 2016, there was the Formosa steel plant environmental disaster, which wreaked havoc on the Vietnamese coastline. There is a huge Taiwanese economic presence in Vietnam, and it got caught up a little bit in the rioting and all those things at that point of time. Just a little bit, can you talk to us about that Formosa steel disaster and more generally about whether Taiwan is a responsible player or not in the South China Sea neighborhood?
In April 2016, the Formosa steel plant discharged this toxic waste into the East Sea off Vietnam's central coast in Ha Tien province. And the incident is recognized as the largest ecological disaster in Vietnamese history. The toxic discharge wiped out fish, squid, other marine life off the coast of 4 provinces south of the factory. And it really destroyed the livelihood of fishermen in the region, and the environmental crime scene stretched, 130 miles along the entire coastline. Naturally, this disaster led to widespread anger directed at both the government and the Chinese-owned factories. And this wave of environmental protesters demonstrated throughout the country for more than a month. In fact, I was in country during that time. And for sure, it kind of marked a turning point for Vietnam's environmental and social activism. Many who were first-time citizens reporters who posted their photos of the shores of dead fish. But in terms of the protests, I think we need to be clear. The average Vietnamese citizen is unable to distinguish between a Taiwan-owned factory or a mainland China-operated one. So there have been a number of anti-China protests related to degradation of the environment. And that does include a mainland Chinese-operated paper and pulp mill in the Mekong Delta, and is responsible for toxic releases into Canto's rivers. But many of Vietnam's economic technocrats were trained in Taiwan, and although Taiwan and Vietnam lack formal diplomatic relations, it hasn't stopped them from cooperating closely in economics and trade. And Taiwan and Vietnam also signed a bilateral investment agreement. In fact, today, Vietnam is still a most preferred destination for Taiwanese technology companies. As for addressing your questions, the attitudes and perceptions among Vietnamese citizens towards Taiwan and Chinese factory operators, I think those fears still persist against both Taiwan and mainland Chinese about the safeguards in their factory operations, and also the sphere of influence in their communities. Citizens that I have spoken to found, well, especially objectionable, the government's plan to create special economic zones to buy up or lease their land for 99 years. Nevertheless, I think Taiwan is still ranked as the fourth largest investor in Vietnam. And of course, in the South China Sea, the claimant nations, including Taiwan, are all engaged in reclamation activities. But I'd like to give credit to Taiwan's marine scientists for conducting international marine science surveys on the status of coral reefs off their own Dongsha Atoll and Taiping Island. But for sure, climate change, ocean acidification is impacting on all coral reefs, not only in the region, but around the world.
Let's get to the topic of science diplomacy, which I think is very, very close to your heart, and on which you've written a lot. Let's try to look at some of the solutions to the complex issues in the South China Sea. You've called for science diplomacy in the South China Sea. You propose this as a way to reducing threats to both the political and ecological security in Southeast Asia. Could you explain to our audience why you think this is the best solution and how it would work from a practical standpoint?
Well, I do believe that protecting marine environments and ensuring the ocean sustainability is a global issue, and nowhere is it more important than the South China Sea. Science-based voices are vital to protect the region's oceans as coral reefs are decline, industrial runoff continues, plastic pollution circulates, and overfishing escalates. All this risks irreversible damage. Science diplomacy can really establish a useful starting point for regional cooperation to deal with environmental and perhaps geopolitical problems. At the moment, what I'm witnessing, there are an increasing number of science-based conferences, workshops, and webinars where marine biologists and policy experts are communicating with one another. Among these biologists and oceanographers alike, they recognize that the sea must unite rather than divide. Science is a common and apolitical language that brings allies and adversaries together with technology and innovation to address cross-border challenges. And for years, science has been adopted as a diplomatic tool for peace building by other countries. I mean, to be clear, science can and does inform policy and has been used in scientific collaboration. Good examples are in Antarctica. And for example, the International Geophysical Year going back to 1957 paved the way for the Antarctic Treaty, an accord achieved during the Cold War that continues today to reserve an entire continent for peace and science. So I do believe that understanding the historical and scientific perspective in the context of the Arctic and the Antarctic environmental policies offers some lessons for possible adoptions in the South China Sea. So you referenced my book. My book, really argues that science diplomacy are these kind of track two discussions between or among scientists. They offer this solid bridge that links science and policy, and it provides a mechanism for long-term sustainable scientific collaboration for improving ocean governance and avoiding conflict. Policy experts may remain critical in the ability of science diplomacy statecraft to bring about multilateral environment cooperation. However, I think credit must be given to the United Nations Environment Program, who initiated the development of the South China Sea project going back to 1997 and 1999 to work with countries bordering the South China Sea to prepare a framework for a strategic action program to address these environmental security problems. Today, I think there's a new generation of young, even Chinese marine biologists and oceanographers who are part of an international marine science community, and they are communicating with one another. And they are actively engaged in supporting this kind of science cooperation. So my optimism reflected in my book is found in even recent emails with senior Chinese scientists who have expressed directly their belief that ocean science cooperation is the best way forward to collecting and stimulating common interest to address the myriad of environmental challenges, including extreme weather, climate change, the severe typhoons, the condition of the marine ecosystems. These are areas that are non-political and impact on all claimant nations. Let me just read you briefly an excerpt from an email I received from Professor Yue Dong, an oceanographer at Sun Yat-sen University. He wrote, and I quote, "I think that ocean science cooperation is the best way to move forward in the collection and stimulation of the common interest in the region to address the challenges of ocean science, regional climate issues, extreme weather, and climate disasters' impact on marine ecosystems." That gives me optimism.
It's interesting point about, science being cross-border and not really fixated by or divided by borders. And yet, policy experts live in a completely different world from oceanographers and from marine scientists. And where at this point of time would you say where do they stand at this point of time? Do you think they are close enough in terms of trying to work off each other, or are they still living in parallel universes? And in that context, can I also throw in a question with regard to marine protected areas? You've voiced attention for the need for marine protected areas in the South China Sea. Are you seeing signs of scientific cooperation with regard to expansion of MPAs in the region? And are policymakers hearing that or listening to that at least?
We are indeed at a tipping point in our oceans. I think among the public and certainly the scientists and policy experts, they see the rising environmental challenges from the fisheries collapsing, biodiversity decline, the plastics pollution, the coral reefs in peril from reclamation and climate change, and the critical spawning grounds disrupted at an unprecedented scale. Food security. This is an issue that speaks to everyone. There's no time to waste in providing mechanisms for ocean governments in quietly navigating the development of science diplomacy to prevent these geopolitical battles over the management of marine resources in the maritime commons. From national parks to fishery reserves, MPAs, these marine protected areas include a wide variety of measures that are expressly intended to conserve biodiversity and provide comprehensive protection for all life within their borders. MPAs are rising in popularity around the world because of their potential to preserve and restore marine ecosystems, and they enhance their resilience to climate change impacts. Unfortunately, and I understand those skeptics, for most nations bordering the South China Sea, they are looking for fences in the sea rather than recognizing that maritime boundaries are not an end in themselves, but rather a means of effectively managing maritime space. So in this context, marine protected areas and a suggested regional network of MPAs offer a political opportunity to maintain a peaceful and cooperative and stable environment. Prior to COVID, in November 2019, both China and Vietnam held informal marine science workshops inviting claimant nation marine scientists, oceanographers, policy experts to sit down and address these ecological policy issues in the sea, from climate change and environmental protection and marine pollution. And part of the agenda included the expansion of marine protected areas, conversations that took place between Chinese and marine biologists on the subject. More and more senior Chinese marine scientists have gone on record weighing in their support for science cooperation. I just read you an excerpt. They're interested in participating in surveys to address the state of coral reefs in the regions, since they know that over 50% of the corals have been lost or degraded. And also the additional common ground is based data about these severe weather patterns, monsoons and tsunamis in the South China Sea. Look, I understand, I realize that the rise of nationalism is a huge challenge for science diplomacy, because the prerequisite for the success of science diplomacy is cooperation among nations without being influenced by territorial claims. But in some cases, this effort can be interpreted as the government compromising over sovereignty issues, which can easily fuel nationalist outcry among the population in various countries. However, science diplomacy provides China a way to get along with other claimants while maintaining its own dominant position on the sovereignty issue. It's not an either-or situation. And it's noteworthy that beginning in 2010, Vietnam embarked on an ambitious initiative to create these national marine protected areas. As a result, the country has already established 8 and will be adding 8 more in the next year. China has also embarked on an ambitious rollout of more marine protected areas since their coasts are severely affected by pollution and climate change. They now have more than 270 marine protected areas. These Chinese marine scientists know about the dire impact of habitat degradation and overexploitation of resources. I think these are incremental environmental triumphs reflected in the expansion of MPAs, and they offer compelling evidence that science reflected in the expansion of these areas. It brings credibility to become an effective approach to South China Sea dispute settlement. I mean, the next logical stage is a marine protected network with an effective ASEAN regional management regime.
That's a great point you made, because, you know, even with regard to marine sciences, as per the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, each coastal state has its own exclusive prerogative with regard to marine scientific research, MSR, in their EEZs, which then gives just that added incentive for the policymaker to do this on a national basis and not to do this on a cross-border basis. And that has kind of exacerbated problems. And that's why to do this at an ASEAN level, or where all the claimants work together, obviously seems to be a much more useful way forward. Anyway, coming back to your book, which is to some extent enmeshed in the geopolitics of the South China Sea, you've of course talked a lot with regard to global issues, to the ocean issue, which is a global problem. I mean, ocean crisis in our oceans is a crisis for humanity at some level. You cite a book by New York Times reporter Tim Urbina on Outlaw Ocean. I'm also thinking of a Netflix documentary, Sea Piracy, which made waves in the media earlier this year. And I wonder, on a larger note, beyond the South China Sea, what else is it that is required, what is necessary to get policymakers to really act on marine conservation and proper regulation of the sea?
The investigative journalist Urbina's book, The Outlaw Sea, I think he brilliantly documents the environmental and human rights crimes that exist on the open seas. And while the media, and I do include myself among the ranks, we have an obligation to present these harrowing and riveting stories and documentaries on crime and survival, but ultimately the public needs to engage and pressure their respective nations' policy experts with facts and data so that these abuses can no longer stand. And I'm talking about illegal and overfishing too. But the magnitude of subsidies provided to the fishing sector by governments worldwide is immense, an estimated $35 billion a year. The majority of these subsidies may be impeding efforts to sustainably manage fisheries with incentives to overfish. So recognizing the threat these subsidies pose, I think more voices, especially those from NGOs, non-government organizations, need to reach out to the World Trade Organization and also to the UN directly to set goals of reaching an agreement that would end fisheries subsidies that contribute to this overcapacity, overfishing, and illegal fishing.
Let's hope for the best on that front. It's great that folks like you are really raising this issue to the forefront so that there is greater consciousness about this issue, where I think there is a certain inertia at the public level, but they are getting involved on these issues. And the more that this is raised both by scientists and enters into the policy community and just into the consciousness of, I think, general people, I think it can make a great change. And I'm thinking in this regard, a couple of years back, I think it was in the Obama administration, I think he declared, President Obama, and prior to that, even President Bush declared huge marine protected areas in the Western Pacific. And I think they have really served their purpose very well. So let's hope for the best on this front. And given your knowledge in particular on science diplomacy, I think this has been in many respects a very enriching conversation for me. Finally, before we close, let me come to you with this question, a broader question beyond science diplomacy. You've covered Southeast Asia for now over a quarter century. What are the greatest lessons that you've learned, and what are the greatest lessons that you would like to pass on, particularly to policy people?
Well, this is a huge question. What have I learned? Well, we only have this one planet, and it's our duty to protect Mother Earth. I mean, she's all we got. There's little time to continue living in fear of environmental degradation and the rampant plundering of our oceans for marine resources. With really all the latest forms of knowledge production, including artistic and science expression through stories and data and public engagement, there's an array of expertise to fully engage the critical threats facing the world from climate change and biodiversity loss, and especially our coral and fisheries collapses. So as a kind of field reporter, I've spoken with hundreds of hardworking farmers and fishers in the South China Sea region. And what they have told me is they know that a community is needed to affect participatory change. Political will is necessary. And the people, whether they are living in an authoritarian state or in a democracy, they can influence policy development. As I mentioned earlier, I also have great confidence in the role played by non-government agencies. They're building more informed civil society actors. I have witnessed this mobilization of informed citizens, and they are indeed shifting policy development away from the state-linked agencies, top-down approach to a grassroots bottom-up approach. This has far-reaching implications, and this makes me hopeful, very hopeful. So I thank you for this opportunity to give expression to that.
Thank you, James Borton, for coming on our show, the Expert Voices Initiative. It's been a terrific conversation. To our viewers, I just want to leave everybody with the name of James's book, which he just put out. It's called Dispatches from the South China Sea, Navigating to Common Ground. I hope you will take an opportunity to flip through it, and I'm sure it's going to be an enlightening read. Thank you once again, James.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.